slide number 1. So let's do one thing. Let's, having known what is project management, what is business analyst, and what is the role of a PM, what is BA, let's look at one of a telecom case study. It's one project, one mega project that I was involved in one of my previous organizations. It's an MNP implementation project. And I'm sure most of us here would know what MNP is. It's mobile number portability. It was one project which was going on for quite some time, but sometime in 2010, various operators were given the mandate to implement the first pilot by end of November 2010. And the timeline for the pan-India rollout was also not too far away. That was sometime in January 2011. This was a very complex project. I'll tell you why this was a complex project. The project was to be implemented across all 14 operational circles of the operator. The stakeholder groups involved were huge, spanning across at least 3 groups. The regulatory, which included the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, TRAI, and the Cellular Operator Association of India. The TRAI and COAI had appointed 2 clearing houses. Those are called mobile clearing houses. Those were the organizations that were interfacing the operators with the regulatories. Those were MIPS, that was the body of Telcordia and Cineverse, and they segregated the entire pan-India MNP operation into 2 zones. Then there was a third-party MNP gateway interfacing to MCH. So for the operator, there was an MCH that was interfacing. There was an MNP gateway that was interfacing to MCH, and then there was an MCH which was interfacing to TRAI. Within the operator, there were stakeholder groups, various functions. There was the IT function which was actually responsible for implementing this project. The next biggest stakeholder group was customer services delivery, which was the customer support function. The marketing and sales, which was responsible for promoting the operator so that people who actually port out from other operators port into them. And then we had the other finance, network, vigilance, and security were equally important, if not less. The other stakeholder group were all other operators circle-wise, with whom the operability testing for MNP was to perform for each circle. So believe me, there were 14 operational circles, and then there were at least 6 to 7 various other operators operating in those circles. So the MNP testing was to be performed with each one of them. Overall, a pretty complex scenario, and there was absolutely no possibility of failure here. What the project team did here. Let's look at the project management and execution methodology. We devised what we call as a flexibility matrix. And again, the project managers here would know what the triple constraint means. So from the triple constraint of cost, scope, and schedule, we devised a flexibility matrix. We tried to find out what is most flexible and what is least flexible. Schedule came out to be entirely non-negotiable. The reason being that this was a regulatory project. Followed by scope. Because the business non-functional requirements would have been compromised for schedule. Cost was the most flexible component, and we were given the authority by the project sponsor to go ahead and use as many resources or as many functional resources or as many methodologies that we wanted to deliver this project. That's where the project team decided to bring in a business analyst, a separate external business analyst. Why? To bring in the telecom MNP experience. Because this resource was involved in extracting MNP kind of requirements in previous projects. Independently perform stakeholder analysis as regards M&P implementation. Now you would agree with me when I say that if it would have been an internal business analyst within our own organization, either the requirements would have been compromised or the requirements would not have been understood. Having come from a third party, this person independently performed stakeholder analysis and made sure that all the requirements were captured. Make sure no requirements slipped through cracks. He did a seamless integration between numerous stakeholder departments. And as we saw in previous slides, the responsibility of a business analyst to track the requirements end to end. Moving ahead on the project management methodology itself, performing organization. The performing organization is an organization whose resources are most actively involved in project execution. So the responsibility for the performing organization was shouldered to already in function PMO, the Program Management Office within the IT function. What did this ensure? This ensured that the interdepartment issues, dependencies, and risks were managed timely and appropriately. This was already in function organization and was already interfacing with the business customers and regulatory authorities. So it was an easier job for a program management office to manage the requirements. For project planning, execution, tracking, monitoring, and controlling, we are coming back to those terms that we saw earlier. We implemented an enterprise project management tool. An enterprise project management tool made sure that all the project issues, risks, and dependencies, be it at any circle level, were monitored through enterprise project management. The timely, accurate communication flowing into the relevant stakeholders for prompt action. Okay. Stakeholder analysis. So see the first line here, the BA along with PM and PMO teams. So as we saw, stakeholder analysis is a very important part of project management. It's one of the essential items when it comes to the roles and responsibility of business analyst. So the BA along with PM and PMO teams section the internal stakeholder groups into groups as below. Groups that had high power and high interest. For example, are regulatory authorities. They had pretty much high power in terms of changing or updating requirements, all the schedule, timelines, and they were the high interest group. High power, low interest. The high power, low interest groups were the groups of other operators with whom we had to perform testing in different circles. Low power, high interest was definitely our own group, which was the IT function there. We had absolutely no control over the requirements, but we had the most interest because we were to make sure that the project was implemented on schedule, within budget, and yes, within scope. Low power, low interest groups were the groups like finance, like vigilance, which had the requirements in there, but yes, those are not as important as the regulatory or business requirements were. We performed the stakeholder analysis to plan and execute specific most appropriate requirement recitation for each of these groups. We looked at the as-is process models, how the business models work currently, and how the business models would change when we implement M&P. What would be the impact on various groups? Each of these groups, when the as-is was converted to 2B. Assign requirement accountability to groups. As I said earlier, there has to be somebody who performs the user acceptance testing later on, who owns those requirements later on. Obtain buy-in, support, and common understanding with individual groups. One of the key deliverables or one of the key artifacts that was prepared by the business analyst was requirements work plan, RWP. RWP contained the detailed stakeholder analysis based upon the different segregation as we saw in the previous slide. It included the scope of work for this BU. It included the schedule of requirement elicitation and budget, the requirements risk matrix. So if we go back to one of our previous slides and see what were the roles of business analyst here, we'll see that most of what a business analyst did for this project maps to what are the defined roles for the business analyst, including preparing the requirements work plan, validating the requirements, identifying the risk related to requirements, and making them visible to the project management team. To make sure that no requirements actually fell through the gaps, and to make sure that the requirements were captured end-to-end, there was a requirements tracker gap analysis report that was prepared. Again, going back to the communication part of project management and going back to one of the process areas of business analysis, we know that communication of requirements and agreement of requirements between all stakeholders is very important. So the requirements tracker was the tool that helped the business analyst and the project manager cover that gap up. This RWP was approved by the project sponsor, and it made sure that obviously no requirements were missed or forgotten. The requirement elicitation was tightly coupled and integrated with other project activities. All stakeholders are on the same page as regards expectations from business analysts and the project delivery team. It served as a communication and negotiation tool for the project manager and the project sponsor. Many a times it happened that our business teams came up with new requirements. That was a true case of managing change request. However, going back to our flexibility matrix, we came to know whether we would be able to incorporate those new requirements or whether absolutely those requirements have to be taken in the next release. So this RWP was a very important tool to negotiate the requirements by the business analyst. How did the elicitation happen? The requirement elicitation happened from regulation to business to the user group. For a typical IT enterprise in an operator group, marketing and sales and corporate CSD are our biggest business teams. So the business analyst, together with the user groups and the business teams, sat, discussed the requirements. We had brainstorming sessions. We prepared questionnaires and discussed those questionnaires with the business teams. The requirements were structured based upon two things. One, the circle implementation, if any, or what kind of a user group or what kind of a business group it catered to. Document and validate the requirements. The requirements were captured in multiple passes. Analysis and validation of the requirements led to additional needs. All stakeholder groups helped in validating the requirements, in addition to serving as source of requirements. The requirements were decomposed into smaller groups of requirements till the time they really could not be decomposed further. This made sure, again, that no such requirement got missed that was either not built into the prime requirements or was a child requirement not initially thought of. So the brainstorming session made sure that the requirements were decomposed into the smallest level. And once again, all requirements could track back to an owner who could perform UAT and confirm that requirements format. So the requirement elicitation and validation approach. He reviewed the as-is was reviewed by observations, by observing the documents, by doing proof of concepts on the current system, by verbal protocol, by discussing with various stakeholder groups. We reviewed what is the current state of the system. facilitation techniques, focus group, targeting on the group of requirements, brainstorming, finding out what could be a possible requirement. Survey techniques, since this BA actually came with a previous MNP experience, so he had a data bank of possible questionnaires. Not all could be done in a typical MNP environment. So survey techniques, interviews, questionnaires were sent to various stakeholders before the elicitation was done, and then those questionnaires were discussed. In case of a conflict, my requirement versus your requirement, which one goes into this particular release first? So regulatory requirement definitely had an upper hand with respect to business requirements. In case of a conflict still, the revenue impact or dollar value was identified. Any kind of a business requirement that was important and came later on was judged based upon the revenue impact or dollar value. So these are some of the techniques we adopted for eliciting the requirements. How did we trace the requirements? So the living document requirement tracker gap analysis report tracked the requirements from a regional stakeholder all the way to the UAT. It started with the original stakeholder. It came back to the original stakeholder for UAT, but during this time, the entire project lifecycle has elapsed, and this document made its way through each of the phases. All the requirements were recorded as they passed through each different phase. Things were not easy. We definitely encountered barriers to requirement elicitation. Multiple times relevant stakeholders were either not available or were not willing to share the information. However, the biggest challenge was that individual stakeholders did not know what they want. And that's what we actually realized in our first slide, that my customer really didn't know what he wants. Even to translate the regulatory requirements into what is actually required, there was numerous discussions with the regulatory teams. Those requirements were also discussed when it came to business. And again, the BA coming with previous MNP experience made sure that the stakeholders knew what their requirements were. Another barrier was that the stakeholders are focused on solution and not the requirements. If in a typical telecom scenario, my telecom fraternity friends here would know what I'm talking about. A typical OSS, BSS, and IN solution, people were more worried about how their solutions would work, how things will change in their system, rather than what is it that needs to be implemented, and how what is to be implemented actually interfaces with whatever else was there in the system. Okay. So what is the current status of MNP implementation? When I said that the MNP was to be launched on a pilot basis during November 2010. MNP was launched in Haryana Circle on 25th November 2010. And I was there sitting in an auditorium in Hisar when this launch happened. The pan-India rollout happened on January 20th, 2011. What is the industry trend? Airtel has been the most preferred operator with many, 26% of survey that was conducted. They voted for it, followed closely by Vodafone and then Idea. What are the most common reasons for people opting to port out? Network coverage and tariff rates emerge as the top two reasons as to why subscribers wanted to avail of MNP. Now this MNP implementation at that time was restricted to intra-circle, and now we have inter-circle MNP also coming up. Okay. The previous slide here what we just spoke about was about MNP at a telecom environment or at a telecom fraternity level. When we talk about what happened to this project in the operator environment, this MNP project was implemented across India on schedule. This MNP project captured all the requirements that were agreed upon with the complete list of stakeholders. Although we had no cap on the budget that we could have used, but the project was completed within budget, has shown positive trend for subscriber port-in for the operator since that time. The best part, the project went on to receive the best IT project award for that operator. And I'm glad to say that I was the project manager for that project. Okay. I